To give a bit of background, food insecurity has many negative consequences, and a sustainable approach to food security is essential to ensuring Canada meets the obligation of a right to food. Our panelists today will help us learn more about considerations for moving away from the current and inadequate approach to food security and towards sustainable food security. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. We have Graham Riches. He's the former director of the UBC School of Social Work, and his work has focused on food insecurity, poverty, the charitable response to food insecurity, and the right to food. Welcome, Graham. We also have Ramsey Hart. Ramsey is the executive director of The Table, the Community Food Center in Perth, and he has worked to build a healthier, more connected community. Thanks so much for joining us, Ramsey. And finally, we have Courtney O'Neill. Courtney is a dietitian and the founder and project coordinator of the Simcoe County Food Council, where she works to foster collaboration and connection to reduce household food insecurity. Thanks, Courtney, for being here. So we will start with an opportunity for each panelist to share just a 1 or 2 minute summary of their thoughts on the topic before proceeding to some prepared questions. Each panelist will have the chance to answer each of the prepared questions. To ensure we're respectful of time, and we are running a tiny bit behind already, we may need to move the conversation along, so I'll be trying to keep everybody on track with responses, and forgive me if I do have to interrupt you and move on to the next panelist. So we'll start with you, Courtney. Can you give us a short summary on your thoughts on the topic of food security sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to this conversation because although I'm a panelist, I still feel that I am a learner and a student in all of this. And initially, when I thought about sustainability, what comes to mind is food is the first thing, and that's what we're talking about. But then I think about the work that we're doing in Simcoe County and how do you keep partnerships sustainable and alive and that longevity? How do you nurture those relationships, whether it's with clients or partners? And so I've been thinking a lot about what sustainability means. I have a little bit of a diamond of different words that really embody sustainability, and I hope to bring that to the panel today and share a little bit about our experiences and the highs and the lows.
Wonderful. Thanks, Courtney. Over to you, Graham. Can you please summarize your thoughts on this topic? Oh, and you'll have to unmute yourself, Graham.
Okay.
There you go.
So, yeah. I think maybe just what I would say is that discussion takes me back 40 years when food banks first arrived in Canada, which we imported them from the US, which led me to think sort of very critically about the matter, because I wondered why in a country as wealthy as Canada, which produces, grains to feed the world, and we had at that time a well-developed, well-structured welfare state. I mean, it didn't always work in the ways that it should, but it was actually very secure in terms of its income-based approaches to people's problems and issues. So why on the earth were we feeding wasted food to hungry people and importing a US-style model when the US welfare state never represented Canada's or European-style welfare states? So that's where I come from, and in the course of my studies and research, writing about it in the 1980s, I came across the right to food as an important concept for actually thinking about, what we should be doing and why we should be doing it. And alas, 40 years later, we're still not doing it. Okay, so that's where I'm at.
Thank you so much, Graham. And over to you, Ramsey. Just a quick summary.
Quick summary, yeah, big question, quick summary. I guess my background is actually as an ecologist in environmental sciences, so sustainability is certainly something I'm been thinking about for a long time. But in terms of the food system, I think when we talk about sustainability, it's one of the questions that we'll be addressing, but it's thinking about the system that we're working within and thinking about how scalable are things? What are the long-term impacts of the initiatives we're undertaking, and what is the real impact of those at the systems level, not just at the individual level? So that's where thinking sustainably takes me, at least. And maybe it's just the time of year, but also makes me think about money and where's the money to do these works that we need to do, and how do we sustain the resources to do it? So that's kind of where my thoughts go.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And yes, it is a big topic. So we're going to get into it a little deeper. Thanks. It's great to hear all the different perspectives that you bring and the different backgrounds. So we'll go to the questions for the panelists. A reminder that we will have a few minutes at the end of the session for questions. So if you do have questions throughout the session, please feel free to pop them in the chat in Zoom. So for the panelists, just for timing, we've got about 2 minutes per response per panelist. We know that some answers will be longer and some answers will be shorter. So that's just sort of a guideline as opposed to a hard stop. For the first question, another big question, how do we define the right to food? And we'll start with Graham for this one.
Well, thank you. Yes, well, I think before we talk about defining the right to food, we need to talk about defining food security and food insecurity. And food security, I think, should be understood as secure access at all times to sufficient food, a short definition, because it raises both the question of food availability and access to food, and at all times actually is another way of talking about sustainability. Food insecurity, on the other hand, I think we need to go to our Canadian research, which is world-class and leading in terms of the lack, it essentially means the lack of access to food due to financial constraints. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And it brings us to the right to food. And the right to food, I just give you a very quick UN human rights definition: the physical and economic access at all times, there's that word, at all times again, to adequate food or the means for its procurement. And essentially what this means, and this is by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, General Comment 12. And what it actually means, it's really, the right to food is really about people and families being able to feed themselves with choice and dignity. It's about food availability, it's about production. And I think if you start looking at sort of indigenous land areas, it's about land rights and about just depossession sort of over the many years that they've been experiencing food insecurity. But really at the heart of the matter, it's about acquiring food in normal and customary ways. And actually that means having cash in your pocket in our kind of market society to go into a store like anybody else and purchase the food of your choice. And that's it's built into, we'll talk about this later, it's built into UN conventions which Canada has ratified about the right to an adequate standard of living. So I'll leave it there. Okay.
I'm sure that you could go on for quite some time.
I
There's
could,
so much depth to this question, and I know you've done a lot of work in this area. So thanks so much, Graham, for sharing your thoughts. Over to we'll go over to Ramsey. Ramsey, how do we define the right to food?
I think Graham did an excellent job of defining the sort of basic text definition, and there's lots of those out there. And so just riffing up a bit what Graham said, I think it's either having access to, as he said, cash in your pocket to make those choices, or access to land and resources to be more self-sufficient if that's the opportunities that you have. And certainly very important in many of our many Indigenous communities, and in the North in particular, where access to land and resources is probably the most important aspect of manifesting the right to food. Where I'm really interested in this, and given the audience that we're talking to, is how does the right to food manifest in our own organizations, and how can we move towards more of a rights-based approach, recognizing the limitation of our food banking and food center approaches. But how do we embody that right to food in the way that we offer food? Are we restraining people? Are we approaching it, as we heard this morning, from a notion of scarcity, or are we saying there's lots of food out there, we just need to mobilize it and make sure people have access to it? And so at the table, for example, we allow people to take as much produce home as they can use, as opposed to saying, well, no, you get 3 apples and 4 bananas. And so that's one small way that we're trying to embody that right to food. And I think that's where I'm interested in talking about how do we actually try and live up to that expectation within our organizations.
Thank you so much, Ramsey. Over to you, Courtney. How do you define the right to food?
Yeah, I would echo definitely what has already been said, that the right to food is a human right. And I always think about the definition that Graham gave around access at all times, with the addition of the financial and physical access. And so I think about what the other 2 panelists have said around financial access, having enough food. And that's something that we have focused on at the Simcoe County Food Council, is how do you work with the community partners that are doing on the ground work to give them the tools to also be a part of the advocacy and bringing awareness to that this is also an income problem, and more food doesn't solve the issue. So that's a huge piece. When I think of physical access, I think of more of the municipal landscape with our municipal elections that have just passed, in terms of affordable transit, safe spaces, and ways to access food spaces. Land access, which Ramsey spoke about, so whether it's large plots of land or just within urban settings, having access to grow food if that's what someone wants to do. And then with the overarching theme of dignity, and how do we reflect on that and ensure that that's what's happening in our spaces.
Thank you, Courtney. There's so much interconnectedness here. And you had mentioned a few things that kind of called back to the sessions from this morning with Katie Martin as well, which brings us to our next question, which is around the current approach to addressing food insecurity in Canada. How did we get here? How did we get to the current approach? We'll start with Ramsey for this one.
I think Graham mentioned that, it goes back 40 years or so when we imported a flawed model. And I think we gotten here by a gradual erosion of our social safety net through neoliberalism and through sort of hands-off capitalism. That's where we've arrived. We've allowed our, look at rates that people are getting on ODSP, on OW. It's not viable for people to maintain their dignity and be food secure, as well as minimum wages. So that's how we got here. And for whatever reason, despite its essential aspect to well-being and our lives, and despite it being a recognized right, we've relegated food security to the charitable and nonprofit sector, rather than having it become a responsibility. And that's the next question: is what's the government's role? But so that's how we've gotten here, from my view.
Thank you, Ramsey. My colleagues and I often joke about capitalism always being the Scooby-Doo villain. When you take off the mask, it's always capitalism underneath. We'll go over to Courtney. What do you think? How did we get to our current approach?
Yeah, similarly, I share those views. I even think back further than 40 years ago, dating back into the late 1800s, counties had houses of refuge that, did feed those who were homeless or didn't have access to food. So we've adopted the food bank model in 40 years, but it's been ingrained for centuries in how we respond to this issue, very much reactive versus upstream. And then, charities are built into a lot of communities, into faith-based organizations. And then, I recently had a conversation with a community foundation who said, we see this as an issue, but the only organization here is a food bank. So that's where the money goes. So if those are if these types of organizations are the only organizations around doing this work, then that's where the money is going to keep going. And so it just kind of, it made me think about it, that we need to be diversifying the work that we do, and not putting all of our eggs in one basket. And it's complicated by capitalism, economic volatility, racism, social inequities, which either leads to the problem or amplifies it. And then the last thing I'll say, I think about, when we're talking about this issue, we're talking about food. And so I think about agriculture often, as I do have connections to agriculture. And 100 years ago, over 50% of us had some connection directly to farms, whether it was our families producing it or family members. And now today we entrust less than 2% of people to produce our food. And so our relationship to food has also changed. The way we access food and engage with it has changed. And so it's allowed a lot of modernization in our world, but it's also just shifted what food means to us and our understanding around it. So many different layers of how we got here.
Thank you, Courtney. Graham, over to you.
Well, I have to say I share all those views. I mean, I think, the historical background to this is absolutely essential to understand. In fact, actually, if you go back to the right to food, you'll see the right to food actually being mentioned at the time of Magna Carta in the 13th century, in terms of the right to honey and the right to graze. I mean, it's all there spelt out. And if you track sort of historically, the role of the churches sort of over the years, and in different faiths as well, charity has always been the sort of the backstop when the collective, when our governments, decide that they don't want to sort of take a hand in this. I'd just like to make another point, or a couple of other points about it. I think one of the other, we talk about rights, and I know I've talked about rights a lot, but I've also come to think that we really need to we really need to understand food as a basic human need. We need, not just for humans, but for all species. And we need to understand water as a basic human need. And we also need to understand air as a basic human need. And I think actually these matters are now coming very much more to the fore, with climate change and the pressures upon us. These are because I think that's another way to get people, maybe governments as well, to actually, to begin to think a bit more seriously about these matters. And the other point that I would make, in the last, if I just go back to 1976, when Canada ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and it signed up to this. And by that, it was actually saying it, took this seriously, and there were obligations under international law to actually address these matters, to address domestic food insecurity, domestic hunger, however we like to call it. That has just been off the table. We can't find one government, one political party that's actually willing to, to talk about this seriously. Even here in British Columbia now, we have an NDP government that's really adopted a kind of basic, supply food to people approach, rather than actually significantly addressing income-based approaches, despite the fact, which is a very good sign here in BC, that they've actually entrenched the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, into provincial law, which is absolutely essential. So why can't we actually entrench the UN comment on international economic, social, and cultural rights into our federal law? This, I think, is a crucial matter, because it actually spells out, in terms of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the right, what this actually means in practice. And we have annually, we have every 4 or 5 years, UN periodic reviews where we're meant to actually consider as a country where we've been going. But no, we're still locked in this US-style approach to actually addressing matters. When I'm saying that, I'm not including, I mean, I've read both the websites of Ramsey and of Courtney. They're absolutely fantastic in terms of what we should be doing. I mean, I think, I just signed up to the newsletter. Sent it because I think it's absolutely crucial of actually bringing these different matters together.
Thank you, Graham. And I think that's a great segue into our next question, which I think all of the panelists have already alluded to. And we're going to be asking about the role of government. What should government be responsible for with respect to I'm sorry, was that the question?
You froze
Am I
up a
mixed
second
up?
there, Madison.
You froze
Okay.
up, yeah.
And now I've lost my spot. The question that was just responded to.
How did we get here? Now, government.
How did we get here?
Government.
Well, it's how do we get, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
problem.
Technical difficulties, telling you, it's a great day. So the role of government, what should the role of government be? And like I said, I think we've already touched on this quite a bit. You maybe didn't hear me say that, but I did. So we'll start with Courtney, the role of government and with respect to the right to food.
Yeah. First out, I'm grateful that Graham has signed up for my newsletter. That is amazing. So thank you for that. But no, on a serious note, when we think back to the definition and making sure that everyone has access to food at all times through physical and financial access, we need to think about what levels of government what roles they play in each of those. And so the first thing that we've really learned about in our work is making sure that all levels of government are working together to make sure that, money can flow through when it needs to, or action can happen. And secondly, making sure that food is on the agenda at all levels of government, because as everyone here knows, it intersects every aspect of our life. And then so next I think about the different levels of government. So municipally, as I alluded to before, we think of transit, we think of planning and zoning for affordable housing. Those all play roles in our financial ability to have more money to afford food. So municipal governments play a huge role, as well as having food and agricultural strategies and our ability to physically access food, learn about food. And then provincially and federally, that's where I think more about the income support programs towards basic income principles and knowing which levels of government do what, and building those relationships with governments. And if there are people here today thinking like, well, that's not what I really do. Like our organization focuses, mostly on food provision or procurement. There's still absolutely a role in your organization being a part of the conversation, leading and carrying out these messages with volunteers, with funders. And so that's a role that we really value, is how can we nurture and support these organizations who do so much of the groundwork to ensure they're able to communicate these messages when they don't have the bandwidth to be doing it themselves.
Thank you, Courtney. Ramsey, what should government be responsible for with regards to the right to food?
Well, I think certainly income distribution and ensuring adequate financial resources is first and foremost the priority in this. But yeah, I would certainly agree with Courtney. All levels of government can play a role. The three areas I flagged sort of in thinking about this, so income distribution, food safety, and infrastructure. And we've spent a fair bit of time thinking about municipal governments here at the table, because even though Ottawa is just down the highway, it seems so far away from an advocacy perspective. We do like to focus on the municipal. And so we've done a municipal toolkit working with our local food network, Food Corps. We did a toolkit for municipalities on how they can be more proactive in supporting the local food system. And we are also engaged by the planner from the town of Perth to do a discussion paper on their official plan and how the official plan could do more to support the local food system. And so I think there's just so much that can be done at all levels, and really encourage the folks on this watching us to think about that and think about how can they engage with their politicians at all levels to push ahead an agenda for a right to food.
Thanks, Ramsey. And certainly municipal politics are top of mind this week. Some of us happy, some of us not, with the outcomes in our communities in Ontario. Graham, over to you. Role of government.
Well, thank you. I think I probably said what I wanted to say about this in terms of sort of entrenching the right to food at the federal level, because, you know, the provinces are also sort of caught up with this because they're also co-signatories to international conventions. But I think actually what's sort of really interesting, and I think that's absolutely crucial, but I think what's interesting me, because I now live in a very small town, you know, Qualicum Beach, sort of 9,000, and we've just had our municipal election, and thankfully we've actually got rid of some of the people who've been standing in the way of these kinds of issues. And I think that it takes me back as well to when I lived in Regina, and in the very early days, in the 80s, towards the end of the 80s, when, and I think maybe this relates a little bit to the next question, that we felt that the municipality, actually, the city of Regina, had a real role to play in addressing, you know, child hunger at that time. And we persuaded them to set up their own task force to actually look at this. And they actually then applied pressure on the provincial government, which was very right-wing at that time. And they did get some action and traction. And I think that, so what you were saying, Ramsey, about having a municipal toolkit, I'd like to sign up to that as well. Because I'm thinking here in Qualicum Beach, we don't have a food policy council actually on Oceanside in this region, and I think we need one. And I'm beginning to think now that we've got a new council. I'm sort of playing my own sort of personal politics here, but I think it. You know, this is what it's about. You know, and at the local level, we need to give attention to, you know, to the land that we have and the zoning. We live on. You know, I'm speaking from the land of the Qualicum First Nation. There are all kinds of issues that are embedded in local municipal politics, or should be, but often get missed because it's all about zoning for the next housing development, etc., coming along, which is needed in some ways, but not often in the ways that it's actually produced.
Thank you, Graham. Great to hear the cross-pollination between the panelists. I'm also seeing some enthusiasm in the chat, which is wonderful. And I see Ramsey shared the municipal toolkit. Thank you so much for that. So this next question, again, like I think a lot of the panelists have already touched on this a little bit as sort of the flip side of the coin to the last question, but what is the role of food security stakeholders? What role are we playing in establishing food security in a sustainable manner? And Ramsey, we'll start with you for this one.
Sorry, I was looking for the link to our official plan document. I'll post it in later, or I can share it, and feel free to contact me directly for it as well. So I think certainly our organizations need to take advocacy much more seriously, and building that into our work plans and our budgets. But then there's also a lot we can be doing, and I think doing our own thinking about sustainability at the organization level. How are we contributing or detracting from sustainability on all levels, you know, environmental and social and economic. Environmentally, I think, you know, we can be thinking about making sure we're using less energy, and somebody mentioned in the chat thinking about packaging we're using. So there's a ton of things that as our organizations we can do, and we have an influence also in the wider community. I mean, at least in Perth, the table is certainly seen as one of the sort of the go-to community agencies, and we have a tremendous amount of social capital that we can be promoting more responsible efforts that will ripple out into the wider community. And I think it's part of a shifting of our mentality from just scraping by and reaction and scrambling all the time, to trying to get out of that mode and be thinking ahead and planning and doing the best possible we can for our communities by resourcing our programs well, asking more from our communities, asking for specific things from our communities to support the work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Ramsey. Getting away from that scarcity mindset, there's another common thread throughout the sessions today. Graham, over to you.
I think a couple of things in terms of stakeholders. I think an interesting document that people might be interested in is going back to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization voluntary guidelines, which were actually published in 2004, because that's a very clear setting out of who the stakeholders are. The stakeholders, the government, the private sector, and civil society. And I think that you know, we could talk about ourselves as civil society, but we've also got to think about, you know, where the stakeholders, where the major big food stakeholders are, and the role that they've actually played actually in constructing the problems that we've got, and actually how they actually, that has to be addressed in terms of a dysfunctional sort of industrial food system and these endless supply chains and the corporate food companies sort of, you know, we could look at the Canadian context as well and be figuring out what, you know, who are backstops for the food banks and have been for many years, and how we're actually going to address that. I think that's absolutely important. Civil society, I think, it's a crucial role, and I think sort of Ramsey's sort of set it out in terms of advocacy and those roles we should be playing. And I think that one of the things that we miss, because I think many people are ignorant and not informed about it, is that, and it brings in civil society, is that every 5 to 6 years, the Canadian government has to report to the UN on social, economic, and cultural rights and the progress it's making. And in this, the context of the right to food actually comes to play a part. And when the issues are being put together by governments, and this is not just the federal government, by the provinces as well, they have a mandate to consult with civil society. And we need our civil society organizations to be there to actually comment on, because these matters actually they go to the UN, they go into the international arena for review by others. And I think there's an important toolkit of advocacy that is there, that's open to us. But we in civil society, well, often people don't know about it because governments don't actually broadcast it very clearly. We have to sort of track this down at the federal level and the provincial level, and through our human rights commissions as well. Because I think I'm not sure whether all provinces now have human rights commissions. I mean, we do in BC, but these are crucial team players actually in advancing, you know, the broad base of economic, social, and cultural rights, and also the right to food, the right to housing, water, etc. And they bring together a lot of the issues that I think are troubling us. So, can you hear me, Madison? Yeah. Ask, you need to unmute. It says ask to unmute.
Hi, sorry. Courtney, are you good to respond?
Yes, I can jump in.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would echo what Graham and Ramsey have also said. When I think of sustainability, I think of economics, environmental, ethical. I would even include emotional in there. A common theme that we've been hearing from our food banks within the region. Monthly, we meet with all the food banks within Simcoe County to come together, share updates on the work that they're doing. And, you know, it's incredible to have 15 amazing organizations sharing the progress they're making. But burnout is real within these organizations right now, just with the increased demand, the level of poverty people are experiencing. And, you know, on top of that, we're saying, hey, you need to be advocating, you need to be working at systems change, and they're just thinking like, well, you know, there's what capacity is left. So I think that's a really important piece, that when we're thinking about what can we apply back to our organizations is, you know, how are we taking care of ourselves in this really big work? And I also think I come at it from more of like a ground level, and, you know, making sure that we secure funding so that advocacy can be a core piece of the work that we're doing in our groups and our organizations to move this forward, versus kind of off the side of our desk, which can often happen in small groups. And that's what we've seen with our group is, with our municipal election toolkit, so many key partners have said we've been trying to do something like this, but it just hasn't been that key priority. And so when you have dedicated time and funding, that's when we can see that action or bring that to life. And then the other thing I think about is a little bit around communication and communicating the work that we're doing. I saw a presentation once by the company Key Gordon, so they market for the good guys, and he was speaking to public health professionals who are dietitians, and he said, "You're so boring." He said, "You just love to put everything out there," and he's like, "The message is lost," and that's really stuck with me because everyone around this table knows the problems, the solutions, but how are we communicating it to the naysayers, the people who don't believe? And so that's something that we take back as well in thinking about the work that we do. How can we clearly communicate the work that we're doing, the problems and the solutions and the impact that we're having?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Courtney. And I think the Ottawa Food Bank Network is definitely, our members can relate to a lot of what you were saying about burnout and about the feeling of needing to do more. We are a little short on time, so we're going to. And I think that Courtney's answer really segues nicely into this. What is the value of collective action and systems thinking in building a sustainable, food secure society? And we'll start with Graham for this one.
Well, I think it's absolutely essential because I think we're in some kind of collective amnesia at the moment about the issues. Actually, having just said that, I noticed when I sort of woke up this morning, I turned the CBC News on, and there was an announcement about Food Banks Canada announcing its just released hunger count and the crisis, etc. And I thought, I don't know, 40 years, and I've been hearing this time and time again. So it's a new, it's presented as some kind of new crisis, but it's not. It's an old and recurring crisis. And we seem to be playing the same sort of record over and over again in terms of how we meant to address this. So, it's a real sort of question. Why are we not angry about this? Why are we not sort of radicalized about this? Why are we not sort of engaged with governments and our politicians, and in particular certain sort of political parties about taking these issues seriously? And I think maybe part of the reasons is that it is complex and we're all broken down into our different systems and silos. We talk about government in that context, but I think actually also in civil society sectors we're in that area as well. So I think this coming together of the environmentalists, the folks in healthcare, the people in social policy, labor unions, etc., is very important. And interestingly, if you go back to the early days of food banks, actually in British Columbia in the 1980s, unions actually played a critical role. Very interesting in terms of what they were arguing, not the charitable sort of US style handing out food, but actually engaging with rights and collective bargaining at the same time as they were feeding their members. So I think there's a whole way by which these systems have to be brought together. And one other thought that I have had as well is the 1980s. I think we had a Royal Commission on the McDonald Commission report on the economy, which I think sort of introduced and furthered sort of neoliberalism. We probably need a Royal Commission actually on our social safety net and actually where we're going in terms of the broader issues that confront us. So that's my take for the moment anyway.
Thank you, Graham. It really does take everyone, doesn't it? Yeah. Courtney, what do you think?
Yeah, we need a systems thinking approach to this problem, helping us identify the people, the places, the policies, the factors that interact with our ability to access food. I love board games, and so I often think of, strategy board games and all the players moving and interacting, and that's what I see here. And I think back to the presentation this morning with the number of sectors that need to be involved in this conversation. I think often about agriculture and the system itself. There's so many problems, yet they need to be part of the solution. So they need to be at the table having the conversations with us, albeit they will be uncomfortable. We have experienced that in the county, in Simcoe County, but what comes from that is that collective impact and the strong partnerships that exist. And I often also think about meaningful interactions with partners and recognizing the people who aren't at the table that need to be. We were fortunate to have a presentation from some of Ramsey's staff a few weeks ago, and around advocacy, dignified access. And one of the things that stuck with a number of people was, how do we slow down and have meaningful conversations? And that's where that impact happens. And so that's something that we're taking away in our advocacy work as well, to ensure that it's not only the people in big organizations, but how are we empowering people who are experiencing poverty or household food insecurity and can't access food with dignity.
Thank you, Courtney. Over to you, Ramsey.
Leading question for sure, but to take the bait, I mean, it's the only way we're going to see wide-scale change and systems level change is if we collaborate and work together and think of things at the systems level. And what came to my mind with this question was this perennial question, and I know it came up as a question in the chat from the keynote this morning, is the thinking about food waste and food insecurity. And I think, if you're only looking at one piece of the system, then you might leap to conclusions about great solutions for food insecurity. And while you've got food waste over here and you've got people that are food insecure over here, and we'll just put them together. But if you take a systems approach, you're going to recognize, well, where in the food system is that 50% of food waste actually happening? And it's, and is it actually scalable? The kinds of things that we're trying to do, at the food bank level to address food waste and make sure people have access to food. Is that really scalable? And is that going to resolve the problem of food waste? Well, no, if not, it's certainly not if the food waste is happening earlier in the food system. And so I think it's really important, and all kinds of great things can come from collaboration. I love hearing about the work of the Ottawa Food Bank. I learned a lot participating this morning about this sort of networking and the role that you folks are playing, being just outside of your boundaries. I wasn't quite aware that all you were doing to bring people together and share resources. And it's easy to talk about abundance and getting away from the scarcity model. It's much harder to do when you're, as somebody mentioned in the chat, we still need to feed people. And so one of the most important ways we can do that is by sharing our resources. If we can't all have an advocacy coordinator, like they're doing in Simcoe, have pool some resources, go to the United Way and say, hey, we need an advocacy coordinator for our network. They love this whole collaborative thing, and put those resources together, and then we can start making some real change.
I'll just jump in here. Maybe I think Madison froze.
She's back.
She's back.
I'm back.
Perfect.
I did freeze for a second. Sorry. Thank you, Ramsey. What I heard was really great. And we'd love to connect more, being in the Eastern Ontario area, to learn more about what each other's doing and to find where we can provide mutual support. We do want to make sure that we have enough time for questions, but this last question, I think, is where we want to leave off the session with a hopeful tone. So we're going to do a bit of a lightning round. So in one or two sentences, what concrete steps can we take individually or collectively to establish food security that is sustainable? Sort of your elevator pitch. And Courtney, no pressure, but we'll start with you for this question.
Awesome. Okay, individually, vote, volunteer, be open to learning, and check your biases before going into meetings or groups or settings and things like that, because then it makes you a stronger partner when you come to the table. Collectively, I would say have very clear mission, vision, and goals. It can be really hard when you have a number of different stakeholders from many different sectors coming to the table, all with a different agenda. Working hard to clarify that at the beginning is really important. Measuring and evaluating and sharing the impact that you have is so important, whether it's for funding, whether it's for shifting attitudes and behaviors. And the last thing I'll say is that we know food is political, it's a passion, it's also a profession for a number of people. And so it can be hard work. And so we had this comment made to us last year, and it stuck with me: speak to the people at the front of the class. So it's easy to get bogged down with all the noise and behind. And so speaking to the people who are engaging with you and working with you when times are hard, because they can be.
I love that. Thank you, Courtney. Graham, your sort of final elevator pitch. What steps can we take individually and collectively?
I think for me, it's really about pressing the case about food as a basic human need and a fundamental human right. And I think it's about engaging with governments about their neglect of their obligations under international law to actually address these questions. I think we need, and I realize I'm not sort of talking about this so much in terms of what individuals can do, but I think it is about sort of individuals, about our being open to learning about where these matters actually stand in the international community and what the implications for Canada are, and about for ensuring that people can put food on the table. And I do want to just go back to this business about this question about the UN periodic reviews. I think we need our activists to be alive and alert to that, and to follow up and to engage our communities in actually addressing these questions, yes, at the municipal level, but to think about it sort of internationally. I'm a member, and I don't know whether any of you are aware of it, of an organization called the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health, and Social Justice. And it brings together people who are engaged in the whole sort of food banking area in the US and in Canada and in the UK. And we have monthly discussions about where we should be heading. I won't put it in the chat, but I can send you the information about it to actually, you might be interested in logging in, because there's a much wider discussion about these issues going on, which I think is absolutely essential. Okay, thanks.
I love what everyone said, and I'll just add, I guess, create and support alternative systems. You know, think about ways that we can do this that are outside the market system. So that can be buying clubs, food co-ops, collective gardens, community gardens. None of them, no one of them is going to be a single. There's no silver bullet to this. It takes lots of different approaches. But I think the more we show that there can be a different way of building community and nourishing folks, the better. That can be both individual and as our organizations and collectively. And the other thing I'd ask people to take on both individually and collectively is challenging the narratives. As Graham said, we've been saying the same thing for 40 years. And you know, it's hard to not go down that road. And I'm constantly challenged by being a food distribution and food access organization. It's where we spend most of our money and most of our resources, and yet at the same time saying this is not the solution. I haven't, you know, we need some comms people to really figure that out, because it's a tricky one to communicate. And too often we then say, well, that's hard to communicate. That's kind of complicated. So we're going to stop hunger, and people will understand that, and they're going to give us money because we're going to stop hunger. But we really should stop that, because it's really disingenuous, because we've been doing it for 40 years and it's or longer. And so I really encourage people, both individually and collectively, to challenge that narrative and come up with alternative narratives that maybe have to be a little more complex, maybe a little more nuanced, but they'll be true and genuine. And our experience at the table, transitioning from a more conventional food bank to a food center model, is that we've only increased the resources we have access to.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Big thank you to all three of our panelists. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Amy, if you could share some of the questions that have come up in the chat. And like I said, we do have a short window, so maybe we'll limit to one panelist responding to each question.
Sure. So far, there aren't any questions, but we'll maybe just wait a few minutes and see if anyone has anything to add.
I noticed right at the beginning, there was a comment about getting away from talking about income, and that can sort of lead to a scarcity challenge. And that's something I'd love to sort of unpack a little further. My initial reaction is that, we do exist in a market system, the way the vast majority of people can, and for this foreseeable future will get food, is to buy it. We can grow more of our own food, but there's all kinds of limitations around that. You have to have the physical capacity to do it. You have to have the space to do it. You have to have the time to do it. And even in terms of thinking about hunting practices for remote and rural communities, that's not cheap either, right? So one of the really interesting work going on and looking at the different impact of investing money in hunting versus investing money in shipping food north. You get much better outcomes if you invest in hunting, but they still need money for supplies and gas and equipment. So it's hard to get away from the market system. And so ultimately, money's got to be a big part of the equation.
Thank you, Ramsey. I think we have time for one more question.
We have a question here. If Graham could mention again the name of the alliance.
Oh, yes, the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice. I think if you Google that, it'll take you actually to the links, etc. But if not, you can email me at graham.riches@ubc.ca, and I'd be happy to share that information with you. Okay, that's invitation to everyone. Okay, if you wish to do that, I'm happy to share it. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks,
and I
Graham.
think actually one of the things I would just add, if you really want to be engaged or see where this, in terms of the food bank side, and I realize it's only sort of an aspect of what we're talking about, there's a very profound, deep debate going on in the UK at the moment. And I think it's a highly political matter. And in fact, if you go to Scotland, Scotland actually has announced, a review of ending the need for food banks in Scotland. I mean, that is the Scottish government actually taking this on. So there are governments, and this is what we need, we need to be aware of what's going on in other OECD countries, because, the food bank model is now being exported from the US, dating back from, 1967, but from the 80s onwards. And Canada actually played a leading role in this export to Europe and internationally, and is now embedded all around the world. And the US even has its own sort of food bank leadership training institute, which is international. So it's a huge international sort of issue when we start sort of looking at it. This isn't to say we can't do anything about it, but I think as we've been talking this morning, the more we inform ourselves and become educated about what's going on, and I've certainly learned sort of a lot this morning in terms of, the community food security and the sustainability issues, the better, because it enriches our understanding. And maybe one day we'll find one politician who's got some standing, who's going to take this on. If we could just do that in Canada, I think we'd be down the road. I think actually one of your speakers, Paul Taylor, whom I know, let's hope he gets into the political field. Sooner rather than later, but I think we might see some change in action that we actually need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Graham. And I hope that some people in this room are feeling inspired. And let's channel that inspiration into discussion. So we are going to go into breakout rooms. You'll have 10 minutes to discuss with other participants. two main questions. So one is, what were your top takeaways from this session? And two, how can you use this knowledge in your work? You'll have 10 minutes for discussion, and then we'll come back together for 5 minutes, and we'll invite you to share the learnings from your discussions in the chat, at which point we will take a break for lunch. So ELC, if you can get everybody into breakout rooms, that would be great. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope that you had a chance to make some new connections and to process a bit of the learning that took place this morning in the session. We would invite you to share in the chat the outcomes of your discussions. What were your takeaways? What will you be applying in your work moving forward? And we'll read out some of those answers before we break for lunch.
I wonder if I could just pop in and share kind of an overarching theme, and maybe one of our members will share it in the chat too, but just validating the feelings that people are having of like a little bit of disheartening or defeat of just how big this problem is. And you know, really also recognizing the systemic change that needs to happen. And so I think it's really important to just validate those feelings if people are feeling a little overwhelmed, or it just feels so big, and really recognizing where your role is and how do we generate that support to have that collective impact was, I felt, a really meaningful conversation that our group had.
Thanks so much, Courtney, and so true. We all have to take care of ourselves and recognize when it's getting to be too much and take a break. Hearing from Beth, a collective bank of volunteers to advocate on behalf, capacity building of volunteers to influence system and government. That's wonderful. Volunteers are such a great resource, and a lot of our volunteers are connected in ways that we might not realize until we ask. So that's a great learning. People are feeling at capacity with the increasing volume, but decreasing resources. Yep, for sure. Tying into that burnout conversation. Empowerment is key. Teaching people how to grow their own food, how to prepare fresh food, giving people access to growing spaces is important. And hooking food security to issues that are governmental priorities, for example, climate change and national security. I did see that mentioned in the chat earlier as well. That's wonderful. Thank you. Organizations that support systemic change, such as Just Food here in Ottawa, or the Ottawa Food Policy Council, are so unknown and under-resourced compared to food banks. That is so true. And food banks were the target of funds during the pandemic as opposed to these other resources. Yes, great point. Thank you, Erin. Anona, teaching people how to cook foods they aren't familiar with, for sure. A communal kitchen and a community center, and how can they be integrated into supplying food? Thank you for sharing, Margaret. Well, thank you, everyone. This was really great. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to all the participants. I hope that everybody got a lot out of this session. I know I definitely did.